Right. So Bart, it's very nice of you to join us this afternoon. To start off with, would you like to introduce us to the Cutout Girl? And I believe you're going to read us a short extract.
Yes, so I suppose the story goes back to the fact that I'd always known that my grandparents had sheltered Jewish children during the war, that they'd been part of the resistance, and that one girl, in fact, had stayed with them after the war and had grown up with my father as a sister. But that was pretty much as far as it went. I knew that there'd been some kind of row with this girl when she was a grown-up woman in the 1980s. And therefore, she was somebody who just wasn't mentioned at all in the family. And it wasn't until 2014, when my eldest uncle, Case, died, that something kind of came up inside me that made me think, I've got to investigate this story now, otherwise it will be lost forever. And in fact, my mother still had a contact address for her. And though initially she was reluctant to meet me, she agreed that I could come and have a cup of coffee with her in December 2014. And the story that I ended up writing in the book began then, really. She and I just connected very quickly. And even though she'd said we should kind of meet for half an hour, I was still there 10 hours later. She showed me these incredible documents, things like a letter that her mother had actually still been able to send or direct with her to my grandparents in 1942 in August, when she was taken up from her home. So the extract I'm going to read comes from that early part of the book, and it actually features the letter that I first saw in Lean's apartment in 2015 at its close. So this is the moment where Lean, who's really grown up having very little sense of being Jewish, to be honest, until the start of the war, when gradually kind of measures tighten on the Jewish population in the Netherlands. But even then, you know, she's really much more concerned with kind of affairs within her own household, about her parents' relationship and things like that, until at a certain point things start getting very difficult, and her mother says, you're going to stay somewhere else for a little while. So this is how it starts. In the morning, soon after she has had her bread and cheese, there is a lady at the door, even grander than Mrs. Andriessen, and not so old. She has a firm, jolly manner, just like the nurse at the doctor's surgery, saying nice things about her and asking questions about her schoolwork and about what books she enjoys. Lean is embarrassed that she does not do much reading, though she remembers to say that she likes Jan Klasse and Katrijn. The lady is quite young, but not at all like a mother. It is a real adventure to be going with her, the kind of adventure that gives you a little feeling of sickness in your mouth. On the outside, she is excited, but on the inside, she feels calm. They are unstitching the stars from her dresses, the two women's fingers moving very fast. Lean can keep her own name and her surname, de Jong, but she must not say anything about Mama or Papa or family. She is not to be Jewish now, just a normal girl from Rotterdam, whose parents have been killed in the bombing. If anyone asks, she must say that the lady is Mrs. Hirama, and that she is taking her to her aunt who lives in Dordrecht, which is a different town. It is important to stay very close to the lady, hug tight into her body, so that nobody who knows her can see that Lean is not wearing her star. Mama says exactly the same things as the lady, and gets her to repeat them, even though Lean feels she knows them already. Then a kiss with a hug that hurts a little, and she is outside on the Pletterijstraat, walking fast in step with the lady, trying hard to keep herself pressed into her coat. The bag of her things, including her Pussy album and Mama's puzzle, is over Mrs. Hirama's shoulder and bangs its edge against her with every stride. It is not far from Lean's house to the station, so their walk through the streets and then through the park, where Jews are forbidden, to the Hollandspoor railway station, is over almost as soon as it starts. The station front looks like a palace, but there is no time to look at it because their train is about to depart. Lean thinks for a moment about her bedroom, close enough for her to run back. Mrs. Hirama talks to her about funny place names. There are lots in Holland, she says. For example, the Double Sausage Street in Amsterdam, the Moustache in Groningen, or Duck-Sick Road in Zeeland. There is also a road called Behind the Wild Pig. Lien thinks these names are funny. She likes Mrs. Hieromer and giggles as they watch the houses of The Hague pass faster and faster through the window of the train compartment, the ka-chunk of the wheels on the railway growing louder and closer together. The smoke from the locomotive is dirty, but it smells clean. Does Lien know any funny place names? After a lot of thinking, she remembers Cow Thief Street, which Mrs. Hieromer had not known about. Cow Thief Street, that's a good one, Mrs. Hieromer says. Lien is about to say, it's not far from our house, when she stops herself just in time. Unlike The Hague, Dordrecht has only one railway station. It is also like a palace, only a bit smaller, without the princess towers of the station they left behind. They walk through another park, bigger than theirs at home and sleepy in the afternoon sunlight. Then through streets with little houses, nothing at all like the 3-story apartment blocks of The Hague. Her legs are tired now, and it takes a bit longer each time to get to a new corner. But at each one, Mrs. Hieromer tells her the street name, and then a funny one from somewhere else in Holland, so Lien presses on. They reach the Mauritsweg, at which Mrs. Hieromer says, Trousers Street, then the Crispijnseweg, Butter Mountain Street, and finally the Bilderdijkstraat, Rabbit Pipe Street, and they have arrived. All the houses that Lien passed seemed little compared to the ones in The Hague, but these ones in the Bilderdijkstraat are the littlest of all. In fact, the street doesn't really look like it has houses. It just has 2 long, low red brick walls with doors and windows set in it, stretching as far as Lien can see. In the road, a group of boys is running and shouting. Mrs. Hieromer, ignoring the commotion, walks straight to the door of number 10 and knocks hard on the little round window pane. In her coat pocket, unbeknownst to Lien, there is a letter. It is written in the same steady hand that her mother used on the second page of the little girl's album. The letter, which still survives in Lien's apartment in Amsterdam, is dated August 1942. It reads as follows. Most honoured Sir and Madam, although you are unknown to me, I imagine you for myself as a man and a woman who will, as a father and mother, care for my only child. She has been taken from me by circumstance. May you, with the best will and wisdom, look after her. Imagine for yourself the parting between us. When shall we ever see her again? On the 7th of September, she will be 9. I hope it will be a joyful day for her. I want to say to you that it is my wish that she will think only of you as her mother and father, and that, in the moments of sadness that will come to her, you will comfort her as such. If God wills it, we will all, after the war, shake one another by the hand in joyous reunion, directed to you as the father and mother of Lientje.
Just unmuted myself. Thank you, Bart. That was really moving, and it's very special to hear the author do the reading. So thank you for that. Before the Cutout Girl, you were writing academic books, as you are in an academic yourself, but this one was quite different. Why did you decide to write it?
Well, I had no kind of plan for it, really. So there was that moment in late 2014, after the death of my uncle, that I thought, I've got to preserve this story. But at that point, it was more to preserve it for family posterity than anything else. And I thought, maybe I'll write an academic article about it or something. But once I'd sat down with Lien, it was this incredibly kind of spontaneous moment, really, where she and I felt this connection. And I think she was really amazed at the fact that I just asked these very precise questions about her past that she'd never really asked. So I kind of got into this rhythm of saying, what was your bedroom like when you were a little girl? What clothes did you wear? What food did you eat? What was your walk to school? And she was, I think, just as amazed as I was how much came to life. And there were these incredibly moving things that she'd never actually looked at. like her mother's letter, photographs. And it was, 10 hours later that I drove away from that apartment, and those images haunted me. And I knew I had to record this. I felt this was more important than any academic book I'd ever written. And then, I said, well, I've got to do more on this. And I made this decision quite quickly that I would go back about a month later in January. And we developed this plan whereby I would go and visit the places where she'd lived in hiding, which actually turned out to be 9 different houses across the Netherlands. So the whole of January 2015, I spent time interviewing Lien, but also visiting those places. And that added another layer to the book, because I suddenly felt this was now also my story, and I had to kind of reveal something of my own emotional journey in getting to know Lien, and kind of partly how it changed me and changed my sense of how Europe was looking.
And was she not interested in visiting those hiding places with you?
No, she has this very strong sense that it's history for her, and she's developed a way of coping with the past, which really hit her very hard when, particularly actually when she became a mother. The initial way in which she, as a child, she kind of survived the war was to almost sort of imagine herself as being born after the war and living this very emotionally restricted life. Then when she became a mother, she suddenly kind of saw her own family again, and that was very traumatic. But the way in which she's come to terms with the past now, really sort of after 2003, when she visited Auschwitz, has been this thing of looking after herself. She meditates, and she's just kind of aware that it would not be very good for her. She says she's got the pictures of her parents, but she's not going to spend lots of time looking at them. And she would say, I can look at it without emotion, but on the other hand, she doesn't really want to kind of re-travel that journey repeatedly and be defined by it.
Right.
So no, I was using photographs of these places to prompt her memory, and she was happy to do that. Right. But no, I think she'd find it quite difficult to go back to those places.
So in the book you say, or I read anyway, you said that when you first met with Lien, she said to you, I have no special story. Why do you want it?
Yeah.
Now, as I run the My Story book project for AJR, when I go and talk to our members about writing their life story, they always say exactly the same thing to me. Nobody thinks they have a special story. And of course, when they start telling me what they went through, they do. So that always amazes me. How did you approach that with Lien? Did you need to convince her that her story was special?
I think I don't think it required me to convince her, at least at the early stages. She just said, well, if it's important to you, I will tell you. And that her main question for me at the beginning was whether she trusted me. She didn't want the story sensationalized or because it would be a complicated story about her relationship with my family. It wasn't just a simple matter of testimony as to the horrors of the Holocaust. It was a matter of explaining what had happened in a family. So I think that was what she needed convincing of, that I would do that fairly. She really pretty much has always stuck to this idea that her story isn't particularly special. And I can partly understand that if you were part of that generation where after the war there was this sense of, we've all undergone these absolutely terrible things, and the thing you do is you get on with your life, you don't talk about it. So that is this kind of huge thing that kind of divides, I suppose, to a degree, that generation from our generation, which didn't experience those things. And it's only latterly that actually Lena started getting more interested in her own story in her own terms. So I think that's partly when she read the book. She read the book in English. As I wrote it, I would send her the chapters and she would just check them kind of factually. But then when she read it in Dutch, she said, then I had to go to bed for about 3 days. It hit me very differently.
Oh, right.
Yeah, so I think then it became something that she could sort of live herself into emotionally again.
Yeah, we have some questions from our participants, so let me go to some of those. Hold on one second. So Elsie Prins, whose name sounds quite Dutch, but I'm sorry, I don't know if she is. She asks, if before you started the interviews with Lean, how much were you aware of Dutch policies and practice regarding Jews during the war and post-war?
Very little. And again, so the story is partly my story because I had grown up with a kind of Dutch national myth, really, that basically everybody'd been in the resistance and that the universal opinion of the Dutch was that, you know, Nazism was a monstrous thing that they needed to protect their citizens from. And I was then hugely shocked when I started investigating not just Lean's story, but the wider story of the Dutch during occupation, that the survival rate of Jews in the Netherlands was worse than any other country in Western Europe, by a factor of 2, sort of, double the death rate amongst Dutch Jews. So that really took quite a major reassessment for me of Dutch history, and just sort of learning things like, which I think are very shocking, the fact that kind of the big Dutch construction firms, for example, competitively bid to build the Atlantic Wall to prevent the British liberating the country. That, uniquely in Europe, there was a bounty system put on the heads of Jews that was officially implemented for the Dutch police force who were carrying out the job of hunting up the country's Jews, that it was, the Dutch railways who built those lines to Auschwitz. So that took, I think, an incredible readjustment for me for what kind of Dutch national identity was. Not that I want the book to be like an utter damnation of the Netherlands. I don't think it's as simple as that. There were a lot of factors that made the death rate in the Netherlands so high. And I don't think that the Netherlands actually ever became a particularly fascist country. Sympathy for the Germans was very limited, but what was also very limited was a kind of spirit of resistance, partly because so few people really knew their neighbors. And there was a kind of sense of, well, it's somebody else's work, it's somebody else's problem.
Okay, let me just go. Thank you for that. Julia Nelke asks, one of the things I thought was so amazing about your book was how well you seem to understand the mind of the child. Just listening to you reading the first extract and wondering how Lean remembered so much, or how you helped her remember so much. I guess, yeah.
I mean, it's interesting. For that first episode, Lean did remember that very vividly. She remembered that the lady who came to collect her, Mrs. Hirma, did give her little jokes to jolly her on in the way. And of course, when you hear that, you realize, yes, that is how you would deal with a child. You couldn't possibly tell them you're leaving your parents forever. You have to give them a kind of story. It came partly from the way in which things started between Lean and I. I didn't know her really at all that first day, and I kind of struck upon this thing of just allowing the story to unfold in its own time. So I didn't know where it was going either. I would just always ask her whatever I could about something. So it was this exhaustive process where I'd say, do you remember what clothes you were wearing? Do you remember what you ate that day? What did your mother look like? What kind of things were they said in the family? So I really sort of experienced it through her eyes, and almost saw her as the little girl, even though she was this 82-year-old woman. Then it does also become a kind of method acting thing, which was a very curious thing for a middle-aged man to do, because I had to put myself into the kind of mind and body of a little girl. And I think partly that was just my sort of training as a literature academic. That, what this technique is kind of focalization, that it's an occluded third person narration, and things like, I invented that little detail in this passage, for example, of the smoke from the locomotive smells dirty, it smells clean but it's dirty. And I was sort of trying to think, how does the world look from a point of view of a child? And what you kind of hear in those moments is the way that the world looks to a child. Someone's told her oh, don't get into the smoke, it'll make you dirty, and yet it smells nice. Or that idea of the lady being like the nurse at the doctor's surgery. Those were actually not things that Lean remembered, but they are kind of my way of thinking as a little girl. So all the time I try and give details in a way that they might come across to a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old or an 11-year-old, whatever she is at that stage, rather than ever kind of telling them as an omniscient narrator saying, this is how things are for Lean. So I'm glad that technique worked. That was actually the first section of the book that I wrote. I wrote the first 6 chapters of the book very early after meeting Lean, because I so much had her voice in my head, and I wrote my own section much later.
So I did notice, for me, when I read the book, it was very much in 3 parts. It was the history of the Netherlands, you're writing the book, and then Lean's story as well. Did you always have in your mind to write it that way, or do you even see it that way? That's how I saw it.
No, I do see it like that way a lot. No, that's one of the things that took a very long time to really develop. As soon as I'd had that month in January 2015, and these incredible things that happened to me, like kind of these moments where, suddenly knocks on a door where Lean had been in the village of Bennekom, and the woman tells me that she's got a diary from that time that they found in the cellar. Those sort of things were so vivid to me that I thought I have to make that part of the story. But it took me a long time to kind of work out how I would kind of interlace these 3 things that make up the book, the historical overview, Lean's voice. And at the beginning, I was going to do it in much kind of bigger blocks. The book was going to kind of really just start with Lean's story, and then there would be a middle section where I'd suddenly say, this is when I met Lean. And it was partly reading H is for Hawk by Helen Macdonald, that some people may know that book, that made me think, actually, a reader can cope with having 3 different things coming at them and make the connections between them themselves. Because I think she does that very brilliantly in H is for Hawk. It's about the death of her father, about the history of hawking, and then this biography of T.H. White. And then, they are actually quite powerfully linked through kind of questions of control and wildness and so on. But the reader has to make those connections. And I actually thought, no, a reader can think about, effectively, I'm sort of continually following Lean's footsteps in the story. You often see something from Lean's point of view, and then from my point of view in reconstructing it. And some readers have not liked that. And, I could understand that might be a challenge to some readers, but for me, it's a very important part of it. Also, because I think that I wouldn't like to just think I can just fictionalize someone's life without showing that process. And you asked earlier about, I think an earlier question was, Lean's memories. Lean's memories become progressively weaker as the war goes on, which is kind of surprising because she's older. So, she's just 8 when she's collected at her door in 1942. And then later, she was 11 when the Market Garden landings happened, when, 30,000 British paratroops were in the sky above her. And yet that she remembers only as this flashbulb moment. She remembers seeing the parachutes, but then she just said, I can't remember how we left that place. And there I had to kind of basically just interview a lot of other people, reconstruct what happened, and put her in that story. But sort of give her a consistency of voice.
Yeah.
But I wanted to make that explicit in my section of the book as well, to say, well, I've invented this, and what does it feel for Lean to read it? How does she feel when I give her this information?
Yeah, because if you're writing a memoir and you're adding your own, you're in enhancing it, if you like. Some might say, well, I was going to ask you, how do you react to Holocaust denial? And some people would use something like that to say, oh, it didn't really happen, so you had to make it up, kind of thing. And obviously, it never happened at all. And that's their excuse. That's their what they use.
Well, I was very conscious of, if I was using research to reconstruct something, it had to be 100% accurate, because you know, there is that absolute fear that somebody suddenly says, oh, this is clearly nonsense because whatever, they didn't have tanks in that part of Holland, or so you have to have an absolute commitment to scholarly accuracy underlying the history that you're reporting. But I think if you exclusively try and rely on just that testimony, you also lose something, because you're never going to get things from the point of view of an 8-year-old girl being collected at her door. Even where we've got diaries, there's not the level of kind of emotional maturity that such a writer could have to really reflect that experience. So I think, though it is a risky thing to do, it is actually absolutely morally necessary to use your imagination to put, I mean, you've done that in your own book as well, haven't you? You know, to give that sense of childhood experience. So yeah, I was conscious of that being a risk, and I particularly wanted in this book, partly I suppose to confront that horrific phenomenon of Holocaust denial, to also give a sense of how one learns these things. So, you know, there are sections of me working in the police archives in The Hague, working through these dossiers, which are actually not easy to understand. I mean, I investigated the life of Harry Avers, the policeman who was nearly responsible for capturing Lean. And, you know, there is actually quite a big denial industry for Harry Avers in the town of Dordrecht. And if you read the documents casually, you can sort of say, oh, yes, that might make sense, because he did actually help the resistance on a number of occasions. And after the war, he claimed that he'd actually been a kind of resistance fighter, and that all of this stuff was invented. And you need to really work through the dossier to work out kind of how he later helped the resistance, really as a way of kind of covering his tracks for what he'd done earlier. And there were quite a lot of policemen who did that kind of thing.
Let's go, thank you. Let's go to another question. Again, I believe we already had one from Julia Nelke. I was interested in how Lien's memories were harder for her to access, but thought this indicated how traumatized she was by then. She'd cut off her feelings by then. So I think she's referring to when she was a little bit older. A couple of years after. Yeah.
I think the book taught me, or the process of researching the book taught me a huge amount about the connection between memory and intimacy. The first sentence of the book being, without families, you don't get stories. I didn't really understand what that meant really until I'd investigated the whole of Lean's history. And what it kind of means is that if you don't have people to share your past with, if you don't have a way of kind of sharing jokes, of crying over things, then they very quickly disappear. And what happened to Lean over the course of the war is that as she was moved from family to family, she felt less and less connection with the people around her. And therefore, things didn't get embedded in her memory at all. You know, they would just disappear. And she says, you know, it was like living at a kind of low heat. It was living that was just living. And she said, you know, with whom it didn't matter. And that then means that she suddenly has these vast blocks of time where she has no memory of what happened at all. And at the beginning, because she's emotionally engaged when she's an 8-year-old in that story, in the bit I read there, all sorts of little details were still pressing themselves upon her. Her first contact with the Van Ness family, you know, she remembers a meal, she remembers, you know, the little things that were different in that family, how people said goodnight. And those were the things that were important to her. She wasn't thinking about the Holocaust. She was just thinking, oh, what are the rules here about brushing your teeth? But then later on, terrible things happened to her that made very little impression on her memory at the conscious level, because she was so removed. She says she almost became kind of like an animal. That she just responded, yeah, okay, this is safe, I'll go here. This is not safe, I won't go here. But nobody do you connect with, and then they don't leave an imprint.
And when those terrible things happened to her, it's probably her coping mechanism, isn't it, to not remember. Let's go back to some questions. So we have one from Mia Woodford. Bart comments that David Miller challenged him to be more innovative in the structure and contents of this book. I did feel it was the most wonderfully structured biography, although it's so much more than just a biography, that I had ever read. And I wondered what changes the sadly late David had encouraged Bart to make.
Yeah, he was an incredible influence on me. So he was the agent I was working with at Rogers, Coleridge and White. One of his brilliant things is that he would actually never tell you to do anything. One of the earliest things he told me to do, he said, stop writing, do more reading. He told me to read things like Fred Ullman's Reunion, and a number of Dutch books that he knew and that amazingly I didn't, like Dark Room of Damocles and The Assault. And he just said things like, you don't have to be so immediately truthful the whole time. You can keep things back. He taught me about that it was necessary to kind of create suspense. And again, you sort of feel initially, perhaps particularly as an academic, that those are kind of cheap tricks to an extent. But actually, that's not really true. You need these stories to be engaging. So I think one of the things that drives the book is that we don't know the reason for Lean's break with the family. So it was David, or through conversations with David, that he said, actually start the book. I'm not sure that he exactly told me this, but we came to the idea that we should just start with my first meeting with Lean, and that there is already this mystery of, look, he's met this lovely, seemingly totally well-adjusted person, living a very prosperous life, yet she's got a Holocaust background, and she used to be basically the sister of this man's father. That was a family that rescued her. Why are they not together now? Why does he not know about this story? And actually, you don't learn that until the final chapter. And David was kind of clear about, having that, I suppose, sort of quite tough instinct of saying, look, why should we care? Why should we be interested? There are, sadly, thousands of these books. So you need to give something of yourself. He also, I think, said, which was quite sort of flattering, he said, you are interesting. So tell us things about yourself. The fact that you are from the Netherlands, but also kind of distanced from it. You can make that part of the story, your relationship with the Netherlands. So he kind of encouraged me to give more of myself in the book as well. So yeah, he was definitely a huge influence. He would never sort of say what the answer was, but he would say things like, oh, I don't really feel I know Lean at the beginning of the story as she is now. That was the thing that bothered me. Why are we carrying on reading, those kind of things? And then he would just send me stuff to read.
Well, he obviously knew what he was doing, because it ended up winning the Costa Book of the Year award. So how was that for you?
Yeah, that was an absolutely wonderful day and was a transformative thing for the book. The whole day was kind of magical. My wife and I went and picked Lean up from Heathrow, and we then had to go for some kind of interviews with the Costa people, and they were quite celebratory. We didn't know the result, but they were going, "Oh, I think you might win," because they'd interviewed all the judges who hadn't said what they were going to vote yet. And so there was this kind of building sense of the day that maybe this could be very, very special. And Lean was so celebratory of it. I think that's one of the lovely things, that Lean has never come across to me as a victim. She, when there was a red carpet at the Costa ceremony, she was just kind of going, wow, isn't this amazing? Here I am, wandering down a red carpet. When we brought the book out in the Netherlands, they brought it out on Lean's birthday when she was 85. This was before it won the Costa. And it was on national television on prime time TV. We had an interview, and they brought out champagne for Lean's 85th birthday. You know, she just said, wow, I could never have expected this, to have this celebration of things. So yeah, the Costa changed everything, really. I mean, the book had really barely been reviewed until it was shortlisted for the Costa. And suddenly when it was on the shortlist, it got reviewed. And then in the wake of the Costa, yeah, you just suddenly get asked to be on things like this, and you know, whatever, a lot of literary festivals. So I felt incredibly lucky with that.
So I should probably mention that you beat Sally Rooney's Normal People to Book of the Year in 2018, and that's probably one of the most talked about books at the moment because of the TV series. So my question is,
she's done okay without winning, hasn't she?
Yeah, she has done okay. But what about the Cutout Girl? Are there any plans for a film or TV
there are,
show?
yes. So the film has been optioned, and they're writing scenarios for it now. These things take a long time, but yeah, the film producer Paul Tribitz is working on it. So yeah, that would obviously be very exciting if that actually happened.
So I wonder how they'll do it. Are you going to get a say in the screenwriting, whatever it's called?
Well, it's got screenwriters now, and I haven't had any direct contact with them at all. I think the sort of general rule on these things is that you shouldn't get too involved and think that you can micromanage something that you have absolutely no expertise over. But Paul, the producer of it, does sort of very much say that he wants to try and cover all the things that the book does, that it won't be just Lean's story, it will also be kind of my investigation.
So who's going to play Bart Van Ness?
Well, I think sadly, very often films get optioned and never made, so I think we're a long way off that. But it would be an adventure if it
hopefully it will get made, and I'll look forward to seeing it. So you talked about the book in the Netherlands. And how was it received?
Well, it got a lot of attention when it came out, much more than here initially. Here was really only when it got the prize shortlisting that it got coverage. And I mean, that appearance on the TV program Pow, where the letter that I just read out was read out by the presenter to, you know, a huge audience on national television. I think that made an enormous impact. I mean, the book sold out instantly the next day, which was kind of quite gratifying. But also, I think there was a lot of kind of introspection and discussion. There was something quite shocking going on in the Netherlands at that moment where we were being interviewed, which was that there were two children called Danny and Hovik, who'd been born in the Netherlands to a woman from Azerbaijan who had come to the Netherlands without papers and so was an illegal immigrant. She had actually ended up being sent to an asylum, and the children had then been put into foster care. But they were 9 and 7 by this point. And an immigration judge had decided that these two children, aged 9 and 7, should be sent back to their own country where they did not speak the language and where they would be dumped in an orphanage. And Lean said, if you want to know what will happen to those children if they're sent back, you should read my story. And she was very determined to kind of use her story not just to be in this special pocket of the Holocaust and that's all over, but saying that children are still vulnerable. So one of the really kind of gratifying things is it has at times in the Netherlands actually been sort of taken as a sort of a bit of a warning of let's not be too smug about our status as a a tolerant democracy, and that the decision to send those children back was reversed 2 days later.
That's wonderful.
And commentators said that Lean's intervention had made a difference. And then not that long ago there was also a really horrific incident where one of the kind of positive elements of the Netherlands during World War II is that the Netherlands was actually the only country where there was a national strike in protest at the first set of deportation of Dutch Jews in February 1941. There was a national strike, and the picketers in that national strike were just shot on the picket line, which was one element in the very strong suppression of Dutch resistance early on. But anyway, there's a statue to those dock workers, which was recently attacked in an anti-Semitic attack, covered in paint. And when that happened, the Dutch kind of newspaper of record, really, the NRC, had an editorial saying the people who did this should be made to read the Cutout Girl to remind them of where this ends. Wow. So it's been very nice that it has been part of national discussion and things like that.
Lovely. So we've got a question here from Susan Stone. I first found the book among suggested reading for teenagers, though some of the story is challenging for younger readers. Did you have an age range of who might read it in mind while you were writing it?
I read all the chapters to my wife first after I'd finished them. So in a way, she was always my imagined reader, but it became quite a big thing in my family generally. So my children read it. I think my son was about 15 at the time when I was writing those things. Okay. So it did have a kind of teenage audience alongside an adult audience. One of the really gratifying things about, well, lots of things have been very wonderful about the reception of the book, but you know, academics have also really responded to it very positively and feel that it's throwing new light on the way that, you know, current European society works in relation to anti-Semitism, or how we reflect on the kind of psychology of war. So it seems to have kind of engaged with not necessarily all readers, but readers of all ages, really, pretty much. I mean, you know, as the questioner says, it does contain some very traumatic material, so it's, you know, it's difficult for very young children, but I think teenagers can certainly read it. I've certainly encountered quite a lot of, you know, sixth formers who've read the book and found it very powerful.
And Amanda Lawrence asks if writing this book has made you want to explore or write another book about Holland and the Nazi history.
It's definitely changed the way I write. I kind of feel that this is really my war story. I had such a personal connection with this that I don't feel that retreading that ground directly is what would be best for me. I mean, I make very clear in the book, I am not an expert on World War II or you know, Jewish history or any of those things. And hopefully part of the appeal of the book is kind of that you see my own learning process through it. I don't think that would work so well if I tried to do the same thing again. But what the book has shown me, I suppose, is that I can do creative writing. Up to now, I've really only written academic prose. So the book I'm working on now is actually a life of one of Shakespeare's original actors, a man called Robert Armin, who was the fool in King Lear and the first Touchstone, you know, the first Feste, and so on. And actually, I've been able to find out a huge amount about his life and his relationship with Shakespeare. So I'm writing that in a way a little bit like the Cutout Girl. I'm kind of combining novelization with how archives work and how we know about things like that. So definitely the experience of writing Cutout Girl has been quite kind of transformative for me on lots of levels, but also professionally.
So just to change the subject slightly, we met briefly last year at a literary festival when I invited myself to sit down with you before your talk. It was in Hampstead Garden suburb. It was actually at my school, Henrietta Barnett. Yeah. And this school was very popular with Jewish refugees in the 1940s. I don't know if you're aware. The hall was absolutely full that day of people who came to listen to you, and a large percentage of that audience were Jewish. I don't know if you realised this.
Yeah,
obviously it's a Jewish area, and it's a book with Jewish interests. But do you feel closer to the Jewish community? Have you kind of been, adopted, if you like, as an honorary Jew? Do you feel to the Jewish community since writing the book?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. The sort of Jewish community was quite invisible to me when I was a teenager. When I first went to university at Cambridge, that was the first time I was kind of surrounded by quite a lot of people who talked about being Jewish, and would say, oh, I'm going to the Jewish Society. And that's probably the first time that I really started reflecting on my own family history. And I would say, well, actually, I think that my grandparents sheltered a Jewish girl or Jewish children. So the university world in Britain is, a place where you kind of inevitably get to know a lot of the Jewish community. But since writing the book, yes, it's been amazing. And I've been at so many synagogues and Jewish literary societies. So I think it's been very powerful how much the book has meant to the community. I think maybe partly because it has come from a non-Jew, that it has therefore a different kind of power to it. And yeah, I do feel very close to the community and have learnt a lot from them, I think. Yeah.
And how do you feel about your grandparents? I mean, knowing now the risk that they put themselves at and how they behave.
Yeah, I mean, I'd always been proud of that. I'd always known that they'd been part of the resistance, and that was, of course, a source of pride. I think one of the things that made me realize quite how much braver they were than I'd realized was when you're confronted with the situation in 1942, which is when Lean goes to them, the general view in the Netherlands was not that this was the war, but that this was the new permanent reality. The Germans seemed absolutely invincible. And, the Netherlands had just been kind of incorporated within this Reich, and it was actually fine for non-Jews in the Netherlands at that point. There was no sense of the war. The economy was booming. The general, very Aryan Dutch Dutch population was welcomed as a kind of fellow people of the Germans. So the choice was continue living your life entirely uninterrupted, or risk not just kind of hiding someone for 2 or 3 years for the war, but spend the entire rest of your life with this horrific secret that could bring everybody down around you, for which you will never be thanked, for which you will never be a hero. The best you can hope for is that this just goes unnoticed. And that takes an incredible level of moral courage to think, I'm going to do this irrespective of any reward I might get, and I'm not just risking myself, but I'm risking my children. That I think I had not fully realized that the bleakness of that choice. And then when you think about that context, of course, it does. I'm not trying to kind of excuse the fact that most people did nothing, but it becomes slightly more explicable that you would think, well, what am I going to do with somebody anyway? If I'm trying to save my neighbors, how would I hide them? How would I be able to hide them for decades? To the fact that they had absolutely no doubt about doing that, and took lots of other risks as well. My grandfather took part in raids on post offices, trying to get ration stamps to feed the population in hiding. Those kind of things. He ended up in a concentration camp himself as a result of that. So, yeah, I think you really have to hugely admire the kind of moral strength of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And of course, they made mistakes in relation to Lean. And my parents were always quite worried about that. My writing the book, they didn't really want me to write it. And they kind of said, oh, well, people will end up judging them. And I've always found that in any kind of weighing in the balance, the bravery they showed is so much greater than any personal mistakes they may have made towards Lean. But no one's going to feel anything other than fundamentally that they were very good people.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely. Right, well, we don't have much time left, so I just wanted to ask you how is life in lockdown for Bart Maness?
Well,
and for Lean as well. How is Lean doing? I don't know what the
Lean's
situation is in Netherlands for her.
It's not as locked down as here. I was Skyping her at the weekend, and you know, she still goes out quite a lot. She's extremely well, but yeah, she's living nevertheless quite an isolated life. You know, she said she sort of watches opera on streaming services, and she's part of this community, and she says they kind of talk through the window at each other. So she's a very optimistic person, so she's fine. And I am also in an extremely privileged group, really. I mean, I can still work at the university. So I was doing tutorials just before this. We're pretty much running things as we are. You know, I have a secure job. I have a reasonably nice house and a nice family around me. So, you know, from my point of view, it's been pretty easy, really, but I'm aware that that is absolutely not the kind of average fate of people. And yeah, it's quite good for writers. You know, you do get a lot of time to sit with your laptop, you think?
Well, I'm not sure, actually. I mean, I'm follow a lot of writers on Twitter, and a lot of people have writer's block, and a lot of readers are finding it difficult to concentrate as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I guess just too much going on inside your head and not enough going on outside. But anyway, and just finally, Bart, please tell us what's on your bookshelf.
All right, here's my wife coming in. It's a bit of a sign of life in lockdown.
That's brilliant. That's Zoom gold.
Well, I'm currently reading Hilary Mantel's Mirror and The Light, which I'm very impressed with. I've loved all parts of that trilogy. I'm really driven by that kind of genre of sort of historical biographical writing. So I love the Ferrante books, for example, the Brilliant Friend series. I'm a huge fan of Knausgaard. Recently read a book which is it is now out in translation in English, by a guy called, which is absolutely impossible for anybody to remember who's not Dutch, but Jeroen Olieslagers. But the book is called Will, which is quite simple, W-I-L-L, which is a really fantastic book about Antwerp under occupation. And it's told from the point of view of a policeman who is collaborating with the Nazis inevitably, though also kind of against it morally. It's a very complicated, brilliantly told story of kind of complicity and resistance combined. I very, very much recommend that. Okay,
I'll look it out. Thank you. So the last comment from Julia Nelke, who's already sent in lots of questions, saying, thank you so much. Such a brilliant book, and your morality shines through too. So on that note,
thank you very much.
To say thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. And we look forward to hearing more about maybe the film coming out.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.